think ancient kings were the most powerful people ever, right? Wrong. We see these kings on giant gold thrones with absolute power, and it looks like they're in charge. We see the pharaoh building massive pyramids. We see Mesopotamian kings with terrifying armies. We see Roman emperors running the entire world. They look like the final boss of history. But what if I told you it was all a lie, a giant illusion? Because behind every single king, another group was secretly running the show. A group that didn't need armies because they controlled what people believed. They didn't need to take money because people gave it to them. This is the story of who was really in charge of the ancient world. And it wasn't kings, it was priests. We think kings used religion to control people. But what if it was the other way around? What if the biggest rulers in history were just puppets and the priests were pulling the strings? Today, we're exposing how religious groups secretly controlled the money, the armies, and the fate of entire civilizations. The easiest way to control someone is with a sword, but the most insane way to control them is with an idea. Ancient rulers knew this. To stay in power forever, they needed people to believe their rule was part of a cosmic plan. And to do that, they needed religion. And nobody did it better than the ancient Egyptians. It was crazy. The Egyptian pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a god. When he was crowned, he wasn't just getting a new job, he was literally transforming into a deity. He was the only guy who could talk to the other gods for all of humanity. His job was to keep the entire universe in balance. If he failed, everything would collapse into chaos. Just think about how genius that is. If you rebelled against the pharaoh, you weren't just a traitor, you were literally fighting the universe. Questioning him meant questioning the gods. It was the ultimate security system. But here's the crazy part. The pharaoh couldn't do any of this alone. He completely depended on the priests. The Egyptian priesthood was a giant corporation of power. High priests weren't just religious guys, they were the most important people in the government. They were the ones who threw the giant festivals that proved the pharaoh was a god. Through these insane public shows, they basically performed the pharaoh's god status into existence. The king was supposedly the head priest, but he outsourced all the work, which made the priests the gatekeepers of his own power. Without them, the whole show would just stop. This wasn't just an Egypt thing. This was happening everywhere, but with a different spin. Look at Rome. The Romans hated kings, let alone god kings, but as their empire got bigger, they found a genius way to hijack religion's power. When the Emperor Augustus took over, he gave himself a title that was even more powerful than emperor, Pontifex Maximus, the high priest. In one move, he merged the biggest job in politics with the biggest job in religion. The emperor was now the guy in charge of keeping the gods happy. And this wasn't just for looks. As high priest, the emperor had real power. He controlled the calendar, deciding which days you could do business. He interpreted signs from the gods and ran the rituals that kept the empire safe. Religion became a tool of the government. If you didn't worship the gods, you were a traitor to Rome. It was an insane way to keep everyone in line. And even though emperors usually only became gods after they died, the idea was planted. They were blurring the line between man and God on purpose. Of course, this started way earlier in Mesopotamia, where a king named Naram-Sin declared himself a god 4,000 years ago when he was building the world's first empire. He was sending a message. His power wasn't just local, it was divine and everywhere. In every case, it's the exact same pattern. The king wears the crown, but the priests built the throne. The king has the army, but the priests have the justification. One can't survive without the other. The king's power looks absolute, but it's on loan from the people who keep the sacred secrets. It's a leash that was always there. If divine right was the software of ancient power, the temple was the hardware. And this is where it gets insane. You think temples are just for praying? Nope. In ancient Mesopotamia, the temple was the world's first mega corporation. It was the first central bank and the biggest employer all at once. These priests weren't just praying all day, they were the original CEOs. To get it, you have to forget everything you know about separating religion from business. In cities like Uruk, the temple was the literal center of everything. The giant ziggurats were impressive, but the real power was in their basements full of treasure. And their business model was genius. They just said, the gods own everything, and we're their managers. And people believed it. This gave the priests unbelievable economic power. People weren't paying taxes to a king, they were giving offerings to their god. Let's break it down. First, the temples owned more land than anyone. They collected rent from farmers, not in money, but in grain and animals. This was basically the world's first tax system, but it was way more powerful because God told you to pay it. With all this food, temples hired thousands of people. They ran huge workshops making textiles. We have records from one temple that show a workforce of thousands, mostly women and children, who were paid in daily rations of barley and beer. The temple literally controlled their survival. If you got fired, you starved. Second, since their granaries were overflowing, temples became the world's first banks. They were the safest place to store your extra grain, so people started making deposits. And from there, the next step was obvious: lending. Temples started giving out loans to farmers and merchants. And this wasn't just some favor system. This was a professional credit operation, regulated by law. The temple would often charge less interest than anyone else, which sounds nice, but it was just another form of control. By giving out loans, the priests trapped more and more people in a web of debt. Third, temples were venture capitalists. They invested their massive wealth into trade missions, funding ships to bring back wood, stone, and metal. They didn't just join the economy, they basically created it and dominated it. And here's the craziest part. To manage all this money, to track rent, rations, and loans, they needed a new technology. So they invented writing. The first script, cuneiform, wasn't for writing poetry, it was for accounting. The oldest tablets we have are all receipts and spreadsheets. Writing was an administrative tool, invented for the temple's business needs. The scribes who learned this new tech became the new elite. They were the only ones who could read the contracts and manage the wealth, making them totally essential. This whole system was a masterpiece of control, disguised as faith. The priests controlled the food, the jobs, and the money. Making them mad wasn't just a spiritual risk, it was economic suicide. For most people, you couldn't survive without the temple. Okay, so the priests controlled the money, but how did they control people's minds? With this one crazy trick, talking to the gods. It wasn't enough to control the food, you had to control the story. And these priests were masters of political theatre. The most extreme example comes from ancient Greece at the Oracle of Delphi. For hundreds of years, the Oracle was the most powerful institution in the entire Greek world. You couldn't start a colony, change a law, or declare war without asking the oracle first. The process was wild. You'd pay a ton of money and make a sacrifice. Inside, a priestess called the Pythia would go into a trance and supposedly channel the god Apollo. The old story says she was breathing in magic fumes, but that's probably not true. But here's where the priests got their real power. The Pythia's words were super cryptic and confusing. It was the male priests who got to interpret her ramblings and deliver the official prophecy. This basically gave them veto power over every major decision. A king asks if he should attack the Persian Empire. Priests come back with a prophecy. If you attack, you will destroy a great empire. The king attacks, gets destroyed, and loses his own empire. The prophecy was technically right. The priests couldn't be blamed. By using this confusing language, they could steer the most important decisions of the age and never face the consequences. This use of public spectacle as a control tool got even crazier with the Maya. Their famous ball game, Pocketok, was way more than a sport. It was deadly serious political theatre. The game was a reenactment of their sacred myths. The court itself was seen as a portal to the underworld. These games were huge public events that proved the power of the priest kings, and the stakes were literally life and death. Carvings at places like Chichen Itza show players being decapitated. We're still not sure if it was the winners or losers who were sacrificed, but the message was terrifying. This isn't a game. It's a necessary sacrifice to keep the world from ending. Even in Mesopotamia, where they were all about the money, ritual was a huge political tool. The daily temple activities hammered home the idea that the city's survival depended entirely on the priests. And this logic even explained disasters. If a city was conquered, it wasn't because their army failed. It was because their god got mad and left. This was a genius psychological trick. It stopped people from rebelling because defeat was God's will, not bad leadership. Across all these civilizations, it's the same pattern. Priests were the gatekeepers to the gods. Through prophecies, they controlled government policy. Through public rituals, they controlled society. And through theology, they controlled the entire political story. They used whispers and symbols, but their impact was as real as an army. So you're probably thinking, why didn't the king just get rid of the priests and take all the money? But the reality was a super complicated alliance. They were basically frenemies, locked in a partnership where they both needed and hated each other. Both sides were essential for survival. The king, with his giant army, needed the temple for one thing he couldn't get himself: legitimacy. The palace needed the temple to give it a reason to rule. On the other hand, the temple, with all its cash, needed the palace for protection. The priests could say a piece of land belonged to a god, but they needed the king's soldiers to kick people off it. This created a constant power struggle. So why not just invade the temple? Because it would be political suicide. It would be a direct attack on the gods, destroying the very system that made the king powerful in the first place. The king couldn't exist without the gods, and the only way to get to the gods was through the priests. We actually have a crazy example of a king who tried to destroy the priests. This pharaoh, Akhenaten, saw the priests of the god Amun getting insanely rich and powerful, and he saw it as a threat. So he did something completely insane, a religious revolution. He banned all the old gods and started a brand new religion with only one god, the Aten. He even moved the entire capital city. It looked like a spiritual movement, but it was really a political power grab. By making himself the only person who could talk to the one true God, Akhenaten tried to cut out the priests and take all their spiritual and economic power for himself. But it was a total failure. It was too much, too fast. As soon as he died, his son, Tutankhamun, brought back all the old gods, and the priests of Amun came back stronger than ever. They literally erased Akhenaten's name from history as a warning to any other king who challenged their power. So for most of history, the two powers just coexisted. The king was the public face of power, the guy with the army. The priesthood was the quiet, institutional power, controlling the wealth and the story. They were two pillars holding up the same building. If one fell, the whole civilization would come crashing down. This secret dance for power was the real engine of the ancient world. The story of power is never as simple as it looks, is it? History is filled with these hidden forces that are secretly running our world. If you think these deep dives are insane, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And let me know in the comments, which ancient civilization's power structure was the craziest, and why? When you look back, it's obvious that religion wasn't just a part of their culture. It was the entire operating system of ancient society. It was the constitution, the central bank, and the school system all rolled into one. Religion was the ultimate political hack. It gave a divine reason for why some people were rich and others were poor, making it seem natural. It created total economic control by owning the land, the jobs, and the credit, making obedience a matter of survival. It made rulers legitimate by turning them into gods. and it controlled daily life through rituals and massive buildings that constantly reminded you who was in charge. So the king and the priest weren't just ruler and subject, they were partners in a crazy dance. The palace needed the legitimacy only the temple could give, and the temple needed the protection only the palace could provide. They were tied together, totally codependent, and always in a power struggle. Understanding this is the key to understanding how ancient empires were built. The hidden power of religion wasn't just a feature of their world, it was the entire blueprint. And in that endless fight between the person on the throne and the power behind it, we can see a struggle that has shaped history for thousands of years and is still shaping it today.